So it's a new year, and what better way to celebrate than to complain about something from last year that still really bugs me. So the Attack on Titan anime has ended, but the reception it received was a bit different from the reception the manga ending got. The manga ending had people split down the middle, with about half thinking the ending was okay, and the other half thinking the ending was absolutely terrible. I fell into the latter group. The anime, however, has gotten a more positive reception, and while there were still some people who thought that the ending was terrible, the overall consensus seems to be that the ending was okay. Which for me has been a bit disheartening to say the least, because none of the problems with the manga ending were fixed in the anime. Sure, the anime had great animation, great action, great voice acting, great music, and great presentation. But in the end, none of that matters when the writing is still atrocious. I'm sure the final season of Game of Thrones also had great action, great acting, great music, and so on, but in the end, none of it could make up for the terrible writing. Now let me be clear, the ending was not devoid of good things. It did have some very effective and even beautiful moments, but those can't outweigh the negative impacts that the bad and often baffling writing decisions caused. I've already covered the reasons why I thought the ending didn't work, and how I thought the story of Attack on Titan should have ended, so I won't go over that again here. I'll just put links to those in the description. For this video, I just want to focus on one aspect of the ending, the one that for me is unforgivable, namely what it did to Eren Yeager.
Look how they mess with my boy.
Most of the problems with the ending can be boiled down to good ideas that were executed horribly, but when it comes to Eren's character, what was done to him was a bad idea that was executed badly. And to explain why it was so bad, we need to discuss subverting expectations. Whenever someone tells a story, the audience will naturally develop certain expectations about the story. If a story opens up with a murder, and the main characters are detectives or investigators, then it's reasonable to assume that the story will be about solving the murder. Now, once a story has set up certain expectations, it can do one of two things. It can either meet those expectations, or it can subvert them. And generally speaking, whether or not a story can get away with subverting expectations depends on the nature of the subversion. If the subversion is more interesting, or at least equally interesting to the initial expectations the audience had, then the story can get away with it. But if the subversion is less interesting than the initial expectations, then the audience is less likely to accept it. And if the subversion is significantly worse than the initial expectations, the audience will likely reject it outright. For an example of a story that did this well, let's take a look at Terminator 2, which I just watched for the first time in 2023, and despite being over 30 years old, it still holds up incredibly well, and you should absolutely watch it if you haven't yet. When the film starts, it makes you think that the same thing as the first film is happening again. The T-800 is once again sent back, and another individual who appears to be just a human is also sent back. Based on the events of the first film, it's easy to assume that the T-800 is here to once again try to kill John Connor, while the other person is presumed to be the human protector sent to defend John Connor. This is further reinforced by the fact that we are given explicit proof almost immediately that the T-800 is a Terminator, while the other guy seems to be just human. There is some ambiguity about which one is the protector and which one is the killer, but the overall implications are clear. So it's a genuine surprise when the scene in the hallway happens, and instead of shooting John, the T-800 tells him to get down and shoots at the other guy. This is a subversion of expectations that works because it turns our expectations on their head and replaces it with something much more compelling. Instead of just having it be a human fighting a Terminator again like the first film, this time it's the villain of the first film being the good guy going up against an even more dangerous Terminator, taking things to the next level and elevating the stakes. It's an example of subverting expectations that went really, really well. For an example of subverting expectations that went really poorly, let's take a look at one of the internet's favorite punching bags, The Last Jedi. Now this film has a lot of problems, and for many one of the most unforgivable is what they did to Luke. And I would agree. For most of the film, he's just a grumpy old man whose character is essentially just Yoda except with all of the humor and likability removed. But it's how he ended up this way that really rubbed people the wrong way, namely what he did that resulted in Kylo Ren destroying his academy and joining the First Order. Now Luke in the original trilogy was young, naive, and inexperienced. But when he found out that the second most evil man in the galaxy was his father, his goal became to try to redeem him. Despite everything that Anakin had done and what he had become, Luke believed that there was still good in his father and that he could bring him back. And in the end, he was right. By the time Luke founded the Jedi Academy, he was clearly a much different person. He was older, more experienced, and more careful. He'd grown and learned throughout his journey in the original trilogy. And now Kylo Ren, his nephew, is being tempted toward the dark side. Now, based on everything that has been established and set up, what are our expectations for Luke? Well, if he thought that Darth Vader, a man who had committed countless evil acts, could be redeemed, then surely he would give his nephew, who hadn't actually done anything wrong yet, a chance at redemption. Surely he would try to talk things out, ask Kylo Ren why he was being tempted to the dark side, be honest about his own struggles with the dark side, and try to help him. That is what our expectations would lead us to believe. But instead, the film has Luke immediately pull out his lightsaber, preparing to kill his nephew. Darth Vader had to provoke Luke into attacking him, and this was when Luke was still young and learning. But an older Luke, who should have learned from that, is just going to immediately jump to the conclusion that killing his nephew is the right thing to do? Really? For many people, myself included, this was too jarring and too disconnected from our expectations to be forgivable. In order for Luke to pull out that lightsaber instantly, just like that, ready to kill his nephew, he would have had to have regressed as a character. He would have had to have taken everything he learned from the original trilogy and completely forgotten all of it. With Luke choosing this action in this moment, the original trilogy might as well have not happened at all. I understand the point that the film was trying to go for, namely that Luke, both in and out of universe, can't live up to the myth that has been built up around him, and he's still a fallible human who makes mistakes. But this mistake is too extreme and too out of character for it to work. And honestly, it felt less like a clever subversion and more like a blatant and frankly amateurish way of just trying to shock and surprise the audience. Which brings us back to Attack on Titan. Aaron's character was destroyed just as thoroughly as Luke's character by the ending, but I would argue that Aaron's character assassination was even worse. With Luke, there were at least decades of time that passed between the ending to Return of the Jedi and his attempt to kill Kylo Ren, so it is plausible that during all of those years something could have happened to him that would make him more cautious and paranoid, and completely forget all of the lessons he learned in the original trilogy. It's lazy and unsatisfying, but plausible. But with Aaron, there is no such excuse. For most of the story, he is presented one way, only for the ending to blindside us with something completely different. So to properly explain how I think the ending completely fucked things up, I'll need to explain what the story led me to believe about Aaron, and how the ending completely destroyed those beliefs. From the moment Aaron touched Historia's hand to the moment when Aaron contacted the Alliance through the paths, his character and motivation seemed fairly straightforward to me. After touching Historia's hand, he saw a bunch of his own memories of the future, and what he saw in them filled him with horror and despair. While the story never clarifies everything that he saw, we can piece together some of the events that he likely foresaw. And in the part of the story when the two boys are crushed by the Wall Titans, it's strongly implied that that moment, when Aaron was high above the clouds, was the furthest moment in time that Aaron had foreseen in his future memories, that he had reached that scenery, as he put it. So while he didn't know exactly how it all would end, he did know that he would unleash the rumbling, and so he probably assumed that him destroying the world with the rumbling was an inevitability. Based on the haunted look on his face when the scouts were walking through Marley and his interactions with Ramsey, it's very clear that he fully understands the depth and horror of what he's about to do, and he's torn up with guilt about it. He knows that the majority of the people he would end up killing would be innocents whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, no different than his mother on the day the wall fell. He absolutely does not want to massacre that many people, and if there was another way, he would take it. But there is no other way. One by one, his future memories come to pass exactly as he had foreseen them, and it became more and more obvious that the situation with the outside world was hopeless. With the stress of his situation, and knowing he only had a few short years left, he eventually accepted that the only way to guarantee the survival of his people and his friends was to embrace the future he had seen, terrible as it was, and erase the outside world. It was not a decision he took lightly, it was one he only took because he felt that he had no other choice. So while he fought vigorously to reach the point where he could unleash the rumbling, once it was set in motion and it was now in Emir's hands, he withdrew into himself, knowing full well that he was committing the ultimate transgression. It was all inevitable, and he had no choice but to keep moving forward. There was one unexpected factor at play, though. While he had seen part of the future, he had not seen all of it, and there were some surprises along the way. And by all appearances, he did not foresee or anticipate the Alliance forming to stop him, so that occurring was a genuine surprise to him. In light of that, his decision to allow his friends the option to fight added even more depth to his character. He could easily have asked Emir to use the Founding Titan to render them unable to fight, either by altering their memories, taking away their Titan powers, or both. But he didn't. He wasn't going to stop the rumbling because he understood that the long-term consequences of a partial rumbling would be disastrous for Paradis. But he left open the possibility for them to stop him if they were able to defeat and kill him, because he wanted to grant them the freedom that he had denied himself. He had thought the future was written in stone, and that him destroying the world was inevitable. But now, perhaps it was not. Maybe his friends would be able to stop him, and if they managed that impressive feat, then he could die in peace. knowing that he was stopped before completing his horrific global genocide, and knowing that the future was in their hands. He'd been drawn down a dark and destructive path, but perhaps there was still hope for humanity. Now, all of that was my takeaway on Eren's character before the final chapter came out. I thought I understood Eren's character, and it was absolutely brilliant. He was one of, if not the most well-written fictional character I had ever seen. But then, the ending happened. And like Armin said back when the story was still good, I thought I understood Eren, but now I don't know what the hell to think anymore. I had assumed that the reason Eren was unleashing the rumbling was because he intended to wipe out everyone outside of the island. Not most people, everybody. There were numerous occasions where he implicitly or explicitly said that that was what he was going to do, and that his reason for doing it was to guarantee the survival of Paradis Island. But according to the final chapter, his actual plan was to just use the rumbling to kill off 80% of the world's population, and to make Armin and the others into the heroes who saved the world by killing him. He also said that the Founder's power made it so that there was no past or future, it all exists at once. And it's confirmed, in the cringiest way possible, that Eren did in fact have romantic feelings for Mikasa. Where do I even begin? First of all, I'm going to gloss over a lot of this conversation. What they did with Ymir was clunky and weird. Claiming that Ymir was waiting for Mikasa or some shit was just bizarre and dumb, and Eren being the one to kill his mother by saving Bertolt was a stupid and completely unnecessary addition to the story. But brushing past all that, let's really examine what this chapter did to Eren's character. When it comes to the rumbling, it's the kind of thing you should either go all the way with or not at all. Eren unleashing the rumbling in order to completely wipe out the world and guarantee the survival of Paradis made sense. Him intending to go through with it while still leaving the possibility of him being stopped also made sense. But him erasing 80% of the world in order to make his friends the heroes of the world is so unfathomably stupid. His whole plan was to guarantee the survival of Paradis, but that plan doesn't work if a large chunk of the world is still alive and will be understandably terrified and pissed off by the rumbling. Let's do some math. Based on what was shown, Paradis has a population of around 1 million people. From what we saw of the wider world, it had reached about the same level of development as our world during the era of World War I. At that time, the population of Earth was around 1.7 billion. So if we assume that our world and the world of Attack on Titan are roughly equivalent in terms of population and development, and rounding down to be generous, the population of the worlds in Attack on Titan before the rumbling was around 1 billion. If 80% of the population was wiped out, that would still leave 200 million people. 200 million people versus 1 million people. Even if the rumbling guarantees Paradis' safety in the short term, in the long term, Paradis is fucked. And Eren should know this. So what the hell is he doing? Why was the man who seemed determined to do whatever it took to protect his people now suddenly acting like a short-sighted moron who doesn't understand the consequences of his actions? And if his goal was to be the big bad that his friends could take down in order to become heroes, he went about it in the dumbest and most psychotic way possible. Slaughtering hundreds of millions of people and then letting his friends kill him will do nothing to fix the tension and hatred between Paradis and the world. For fuck's sake, the relationship between Paradis and the world before the rumbling was worse than the relationship between Israel and Palestine. What the fuck do you think it will be like after the rumbling? It doesn't matter what the survivors of the Alliance do, even if they are hailed as heroes, at best they can delay the conflict. But it's only a matter of time before conflict arises again. Seriously, if you want to have a Zero Requiem style ending, you can't have your protagonist slaughter hundreds of millions of civilians beforehand. That just doesn't make any sense. And the fact that the Founding Titan apparently sees everything, past, present, and future, makes all of this so much worse. Before the final chapter, the story was heavily implying that Eren saw some, but not all, of the future, and that made him a compelling and nuanced character. You could see and understand how he ended up the way he did. But by changing it so that he knew everything in advance, it just ruins it completely. Apparently he knew how everything was going to end up, and if his 80% plan is anything to go by, he either doesn't care whether Paradis survives or not, or he's a fucking idiot who doesn't understand what he's doing. So if he knows how everything is going to turn out, and he doesn't really want to do it, why is he going along with it anyway? Why is the character who has been defined as the guy who strives for freedom no matter what just meekly surrendering to the whims of fate? Really, if Eren knows that he won't complete the rumbling in the end, and that Paradis is probably doomed no matter what, and that he feels unbelievably guilty about killing all these people in the future, then why doesn't he just not do it? Why didn't he just say, fuck it, go, no fate but what we make for ourselves, and run off with Mikasa and elope. I mean, that dream sequence indicates that that's what he would have rather have done. If, as the ending clumsily confirms, Eren cares about Mikasa more than anyone else, then why didn't he do that? Why did he go through with a genocide that he knew wasn't going to work? This ending changes Eren's entire character from a tragic figure forced down a dark path by the cruelty of the world and his desire for freedom at any cost, to a mere pawn for the plot. With this ending, the Eren we cared about ceased to exist when he touched Historia's hand, and was replaced with a husk. A mindless drone who just does whatever the story tells him to do. He says he'll just keep moving forward until all his enemies are destroyed when the plot says to, and he'll say he only planned to kill 80% when the plot says to. He'll be silent and ambiguous about his feelings for Mikasa when the plot says to, and he'll awkwardly blurt out how he really feels at the last minute when the plot tells him to. Giving Eren omniscience and having him do and say the things he did makes it clear that he's not a character anymore. He's just a walking plot device, a narrative tool devoid of agency, and those of us who found him so compelling before were just reading more depth into him than what was actually there. Basically, what makes this ending so terrible is that it makes us painfully aware of the hand of the author, and it's clear that he doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. And what makes it even worse is that this is how Eren goes out. Eren spends his last moments talking about confusing and bizarre new narrative elements that make no sense, and then whines about Mikasa finding someone else after he's gone like a fucking spoiled child. Just like how Luke went from this to this, Eren went from this to this. How the mighty have fallen. It's disgraceful and it's unforgivable. It's not the only problem I have with the ending. I have a whole laundry list of things that made no sense, but for me this is the key thing that had to be fixed in order for me to find the anime ending acceptable, and it wasn't. The additional words added to the conversation in the anime don't help anything. They just weakly acknowledge that this final conversation between Eren and Armin was a badly written mess while not actually fixing anything. You can't take your protagonist, make him sympathetic and understandable even as he's committing global genocide, only to pull the rug out from under us at the last minute and make the protagonist's motivation seem petty and nonsensical, and retroactively make the global genocide seem pointless and unnecessarily cruel. You can't do that and expect us to still take this bullshit seriously anymore. Especially since destroying Eren's character destroys the story along with him given how central he was to the narrative. Seriously, fuck you, Isayama, and fuck everyone who has let him get away with this shit. The ending hasn't killed my love for Attack on Titan, but it has thrown a bucket of icy water on it. As a whole, Attack on Titan is still amazing, and is full of moments that are epic, moving, beautiful, and unforgettable. But now all of it is tainted with a nagging knowledge of what it all amounts to in the end, which is nothing. I've heard some people try to argue that that's the point, that everything is meaningless and that nothing ever changes or improves. But if that was the message the story was trying to get across, then really it should have gone with the ending where Eren killed the Alliance and completed the rumbling. Then it could be like the ending to The Godfather Part 2, where the protagonist technically won, but in the process killed or alienated everyone they cared about, leaving them in the end to wonder if it was really worth it. But with the way the story unraveled at the end, I don't know what the message was supposed to be, or even if there was supposed to be a message at all. And that really sucks. It's always disappointing to be yanked back to reality when you realize that what you were watching wasn't actually anything special, it was just another story. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This video is rather different from the kind of things I normally do on this channel, and it's pretty much a one-off, as I wanted a little more closure on this subject, but it's not something I'll be doing again, or at least probably not. I can't say for certain because, well, life is unpredictable. And for me personally, 2023 was a really, really shitty year. Not because of how Attack on Titan ended, although that certainly didn't help, but for a whole bunch of things that just didn't go my way at all. Basically, 2023 was to me what 2020 was to the wider world, and I am so glad it's over. I don't know if 2024 will be better, but hopefully it will at least not be worse.